Good afternoon and welcome to the Committees on Governmental Operations, jointly with Small Business. At this time, we ask if you could please place phones on vibrate or silent mode. Thank you, chairs. We are ready to begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Councilmember Julie Menin, Chair of the Committee on Small Business, and I want to thank everyone for joining today's joint hearing of the Committee of Small Business and the Committee of Government Operations. I first of all want to begin by thanking my co-chair for today's hearing, Councilmember Sandra Ung, Chair of the Committee of Governmental Operations, for her great support in putting together this important hearing, and I will acknowledge colleagues as they join us. Over the past 3 years, small business owners have been significantly challenged by the pandemic in New York City. Roughly 60,000 businesses had to shut down their doors of normal operations, and over 26,000 small businesses were forced to shut down permanently. Economic relief from burdensome regulation has been necessary at the federal, state, and local levels to protect our city's small businesses. Small businesses are obviously integral to our communities. They are literally the backbone of our local economy and contribute to the very vibrant landscape that is New York City. Support for small businesses has always been a top priority, but after the devastating effects of the pandemic, initiatives and legislation designed to mitigate these effects and to support the growth of small businesses have become even more crucial. Small business owners deserve a fair and a fighting chance. In 2021, the Small Business Committee introduced and enacted Local Law 80, which reduced penalties and provided new opportunities for small businesses to correct first-time violations without paying a fine. With the more recent introduction of the Small Business Forward Executive Order, we've seen additional steps taken to overhaul some of the unnecessary and overly costly violations that burden small businesses and hinder their ability to grow. While it's important to celebrate the steps taken to uplift small businesses in need, there is still great room for improvement, and I'm proud that we're here today to discuss 2 of my bills that will support small business owners and grant small businesses the opportunity to assist vulnerable New Yorkers. My first bill, which is Intro 815 from the Committee on Government Operations, addresses the rules of construction for unspecified ranges of civil penalties. While the Council establishes penalty amounts for violations that are presented in a range, it is ultimately up to the city agencies to establish a penalty schedule. Currently, agencies may set the penalty for a first-time violation higher than the minimum without specifying aggregating factors justifying the higher amount. Intro 815 would amend this so that for all first-time violations, the default amount is the lowest in the range. This reduces the element of surprise when paying a penalty and creates an even playing field for small business owners across the city. I'm grateful that Mayor Adams and his administration has begun to right the wrongs of previous administrations on fines, such as improper placement of barber poles that were set at $150 rather than $50, or displaying banners without a DOT permit that were set at $450 instead of $150. My second bill, Intro 491 from the Committee on Small Business, similarly addresses first-time violations and gives businesses that serve food the opportunity to correct certain first-time violations without paying the fine. Instead of a fine, these establishments would be expected to donate their excess food to food pantries and banks across New York City through an agency-created portal. Intro 491 is particularly important as New York grapples with an extreme hunger crisis. Over 1.5 million New Yorkers are experiencing food insecurity, including 1 in 4 children. These numbers were only exacerbated by the pandemic as well as the need to feed asylum seekers. The number of New Yorkers that visited food pantries and soup kitchens in 2022 was significantly higher than in 2019. Redirecting edible and nutritious excess food that would otherwise go to waste to New Yorkers that need it the most not only challenges the rising rates of food insecurity, but can provide small business owners with economic relief by incentivizing donations as a form of violation forgiveness. I look forward to hearing testimony from the administration, from small business owners and advocates on these 2 bills today. I want to thank CJ Murray, Erica Cohen, Rebecca Barilla from Central Staff for their work in putting together this hearing, as well as my own Chief of Staff, Jonathan Shutt, and Legislative and Budget Director Brandon Jordan for their assistance. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Councilmember Ung to provide her opening statement. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm City Council Member Sandra Ong, Chair of the Committee on Governmental Operations. I'm thrilled to be conducting today's hearing jointly with the Small Business Committee, and I would like to begin by thanking my co-chair, Councilmember Julie Menon, and her team for their hard work in putting together this hearing. Small businesses are the heart of so many New York City's neighborhoods and are a large part of what makes the city unique. COVID has devastated our small business community, with an estimated 20% of the city's small businesses being forced to close since the beginning of the pandemic. These businesses need our help, and now is not the time to be subjecting them to unnecessary large fines, particularly for the first-time violations. The New York City Charter, Administrative Code, and rules are full of requirements that come with civil penalties when they are violated. And when we at the City Council set ranges for these penalties, it is the agencies that ultimately set the penalty schedule or add the necessary details when a penalty schedule is already established by local law. Many provisions that specify a minimum penalty don't actually require the minimum fine to be imposed for a first-time violation. Today we'll be discussing Chair Menon's bill that require all agencies to specify aggravating factors when they set a fine for a first violation that is higher than the minimum amount in the law. I am hopeful that this bill, along with the other bill by Chair Menon being heard today, will help small business by reducing and bringing greater clarity to the fines that they owe to the city. And with that, I'd like to thank the members of the public, the representatives from the Department of Sanitation and the Department of Consumer and Workers Protection. I also want to thank CJ Murray, Rebecca Barilla, and Erica Cohen for the central staff for their work in putting this hearing together. And finally, I'd like to thank my own Chief of Staff, Alexander Hart, for his assistance. And now I'd like to turn it back to my co-chair, Councilmember Menon.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Ung. I also want to say we have been joined remotely by Councilmember Tiffany Caban. CJ, I believe she's coming on now. Yep. Okay, she'll be on in a minute. Okay. But CJ, I'll turn it over to you for the administration. Thank you.
Thank you, chairs. We'll now hear from the administration. Before we begin, I will administer the affirmation. Panelists, please raise your right hand. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before these committees, and to respond honestly to council member questions?
I do.
Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman and Chair Ung, and members of the Committees on Small Business and Government Operations. My name is Carlos Ortiz, and I'm the Assistant Commissioner for External Affairs at the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. I am joined by Michael Tiger, DCWP's General Counsel, and my colleague Gregory Anderson, Deputy Commissioner at the Department of Sanitation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on today's legislation. DCWP has been steadfast in its commitment to supporting small businesses in New York City. We do this in a number of ways. Our dedicated outreach teams share informational materials and conduct hundreds of educational events each year, partnering with sister agencies such as the Department of Small Business Services to bring resources to local businesses. DCWP's Visiting Inspector Program has served more than 10,000 individual businesses since 2017, providing free, one-on-one educational inspections by a senior inspector. These efforts ensure that businesses have access to information regarding their requirements to operate in New York City, through which we hope to facilitate a culture of compliance with laws and rules that the Council and the Administration have established. And through our equitable enforcement and progressive discipline model, we prioritize our enforcement efforts against recidivist, non-compliant businesses to ensure that the city's marketplace is free from predatory actors. Moreover, DCWP regularly and meticulously assesses the provisions of the administrative code we enforce to ensure that the civil penalties we issue are appropriate and not overly burdensome on our city's small businesses. For example, in 2021, we worked with the Council to pass Local Law 80, which made business-friendly changes to over 30 categories or areas of our enforcement and substantially lowered penalties for over 150 individual violations that DCWP enforces. Local Law 80 also lowered civil penalties to $0 for the first-time offenses, for the first-time offense of 12 violations, and added the ability to cure a first-time violation for dozens more. Lastly, it repealed outdated or redundant licensing requirements to provide relief to small businesses recovering from the economic impact of the pandemic. In 2022, as part of Mayor Adams' Small Business Forward initiative, DCWP proposed an additional 24 reforms, principally to lower civil penalties to $0 for the first-time violations, which are projected to save businesses almost $1 million. The bill to implement those reforms and similar reforms proposed by many other city agencies, also known as Introduction 845, is currently before the Council, carried by Chair Menon. The administration looks forward to seeing it advance and provide substantial relief to New York City small businesses. Along those lines, I would like to describe for the committees today how DCWP establishes public penalty schedules for the laws it enforces. When the Council passes legislation that involves a range of penalties, DCWP will engage in rulemaking to establish a specific penalty for the first violation that weighs into consideration our knowledge of the industry, our knowledge of the harm that has been identified by the legislation, and the potential for deterrence of that harm. The proposed penalties share with the public in order for elected officials, community boards, consumers, workers, and businesses to provide feedback. When the penalty schedule is finalized, it is publicly available. Subsequently, whenever an oath hearing officer issues a decision against the business, they will use the publicly available penalty schedule to assess a penalty against the business. Today, there are two bills for consideration at this hearing. The first, Introduction 491, would require the Department of Sanitation and DCWP to establish a program for food service establishments to donate their excess food. In return, see civil penalties waived. DCWP defers to DSNY with respect to this legislation. Introduction 815 relates to administrative code provisions that have a range of penalty amounts for a specific violation and would require city agencies enforcing those provisions to utilize the lowest amount in the range as the standard first-time penalty. City agencies would only be able to impose a higher penalty by establishing specific aggravating factors by rule for each violation in the administrative code, which would then need to be proven by the agency each time during a proceeding at the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings. As I described earlier, DCWP has been committed to continually and intentionally reassessing penalties in the administrative code, listening to feedback from small businesses and advocates to ensure that they are appropriate and effective. However, the administration does not support this legislation as drafted and has concerns with its sweeping approach that could have adverse consequences spanning a range of city agencies. For DCWP specifically, these mandated changes will weaken penalties that serve as a deterrent to some of the most egregious business activity we observe, such as tobacco retail dealers operating unlicensed, debt collectors illegally pursuing a consumer, or individuals deceiving immigrant New Yorkers with false services and promises of gaining documented status. The bill would also require DCWP to establish aggravating factors in order to issue penalties above the lowest amount in a range. Proving aggravating factors would likely require DCWP to staff lawyers to attend oath proceedings, making the hearing process more time-consuming and elaborate for businesses. Finally, as my colleagues at DSNY can speak to, this bill would impact significant provisions of the laws they enforce, and those that our sister agencies enforce to protect New Yorkers from illegal activity. We recommend, as an alternative, that we continue to collaborate on Instruction 845, which I referenced previously, to implement significant reforms to civil penalties as it relates to small businesses. Once again, thank you, Chairs Menon and Ung, for the opportunity to testify today before your committees. I welcome any questions you and members may have about today's bills and DCWP's work to uplift small businesses and protect consumers and workers.
Good afternoon, Chair Menon and Chair Ung, and members of the Committees on Small Business and Government Operations. I'm Gregory Anderson, Deputy Commissioner for Policy and Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Department of Sanitation. Thank you for your opportunity to provide a brief testimony on these bills before your committees today. New York City households and businesses in New York discard more than 1 million tons of food waste each year, some of which is edible food fit for donation and recovery. New York City government has long supported food donation and recovery as critical parts of both our strategy to feed hungry New Yorkers and our efforts to ensure a clean, sustainable city. Under the leadership of the Mayor's Office of Food Policy, the city has released Food Forward NYC, the city's first ever 10-year food policy plan. This plan outlines a comprehensive policy framework to increase food security, promote access to and consumption of healthy foods, and support economic opportunity and environmental sustainability in the food system. DSNY plays a role in this work through our donation and reuse programs. Our donation and reuse directory gives New Yorkers an easy way to identify nearby organizations and reuse businesses that take dozens of kinds of products, including both perishable and non-perishable food. We also support a network of reuse partners, including City Harvest and Food Bank NYC, convening dozens of similar organizations to share best practices and promote collaboration in this space. DSNY donation and reuse partners recovered 29,600 tons of edible food last fiscal year for redistribution to food pantries, kitchens, and New Yorkers in need. and this is just a fraction of the overall food donation that happens in New York City each year. In 2019, DSNY created the online food donation portal to match businesses who have surplus edible food with nonprofits who distribute it to those in need. In 3 years, the portal has successfully matched hundreds of donations, totaling more than 540,000 pounds of food. We are also pleased to see progress at the federal level to support food donation practices. Earlier this month, President Biden signed the Bipartisan Food Donation Improvement Act, which extends important Good Samaritan protections to food businesses who provide food below cost or who provide food directly to those in need. Edible food is less than half of food waste in New York City, and DSNY is also taking steps to divert all food waste, along with yard waste and food-soiled paper, from landfills to improve the cleanliness of our neighborhoods, fight rats, and reduce methane emissions in landfills. In October, we rolled out curbside composting to every household in Queens, the largest curbside composting program in the country, and in just 12 weeks, that program diverted nearly 13 million pounds of yard and food waste, the most successful organic waste diversion program in the city's history. Intro 491, sponsored by Chair Menon, would require DSNY and the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection to establish a food donation program where businesses could have civil penalties for eligible violations waived if they agree to donate their excess food to a nonprofit for a certain period of time. The proposed bill would apply to food service establishments and would only be applicable for types of violations identified in the bill, in this bill by the respective departments by rule. For DSNY, eligible violations could include those related to source separation and recycling of designated materials or the posting of signage related to such source separation and recycling. For DCWP, eligible violations could include those that require the display of prices, the accuracy of scanners, and the posting of signage. The administration agrees with the intended purposes of this bill to offer regulatory relief to small businesses and to incentivize the donation of excess food to nonprofits for the purposes of feeding hungry New Yorkers. However, this bill would likely create an unintended burden on both participating businesses and the city agencies tasked with implementing it by requiring onerous documentation, review, and reporting procedures. We fully agree with the intended regulatory reform as it applies to commercial recycling and organics requirements, but we believe it would be more appropriate to pursue reductions in penalties for first-time violations as envisioned in Intro 845, as Carlos mentioned earlier. We look forward to working with the City Council to implement regulatory reform for small businesses and to further explore opportunities to incentivize food donation and recovery. In addition, while my colleagues at DCWP have addressed Intro 815 at today's hearing on behalf of the administration, I do want to amplify their concerns as they specifically relate to DSNY. Many of DSNY's violations in the administrative code have fixed penalties. However, those that do have ranges of penalties include important categories related to environmental justice, public health, and public safety, such as the transport and disposal of asbestos waste, the operation of waste transfer stations, and the disposal of medical and hazardous waste. We firmly believe that any changes to penalties set forth in the administrative code should be made specifically and deliberately on a case-by-case basis rather than across the board. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and we're now happy to answer your questions.
Great, thank you so much for the testimony. I do have a number of questions, but before I just want to recognize some of our colleagues who have joined. We've been joined by Majority Whip Brooks Powers, we've been joined by Councilmember Schulman, Councilmember Hanif, and now also Councilmember Caban is now on Zoom. And I'll recognize additional colleagues as they join. So I appreciate your testimony. I do have a number of questions. I'm going to start with DCWP and talk about Intro 815. So I know you talked about concerns about how this would impact violations on, let's just call them bad actors, small businesses that are really causing real consumer harm. So that's not the intent of this bill, 815. The point of 815 is to try to alleviate fines against small businesses where there's really de minimis consumer harm. It's along the lines of what Consumer Affairs did, what we did years ago when I was commissioner. We launched a small business relief package where when one word of and a sign was wrong, small businesses shouldn't be socked with thousands of dollars of fine for a picayune violation when clearly there's no consumer harm. So that's the intent of this bill. I'm more than willing to make any amendments to clarify that in the bill that makes it clear that we, again, are not trying to in any way get bad actors who are causing real consumer harm off the hook. So my question really is that, you know, the intent of the bill, that is what the intent of the bill is. So how can we get to that issue? How can we make it easier for these small businesses so that when agencies are doing their rulemaking, they're not going beyond the power of the council? Because that's really, again, what this bill is meant to do. The council passes a bill, they say the minimum fine should be X, but then via agency rulemaking, the agencies are going beyond where the council is, and that's really what's causing some of the problems. So that's sort of the crux of the issue, and very open to, you know, additional changes, but that's really what I'm trying to get at here.
Thank you, Chairman, and it's certainly comforting to hear the intent that you've outlined for the bill. I think currently as drafted, though, those significant bad actors would themselves, the penalties for them would be lowered significantly. For example, a tobacco retail dealer that's operating unlicensed, their penalty would go from $2,000 to $200. So if that's an issue in the drafting, that was a major concern that we had, these bad actors, so to speak, and you know, we're happy to work with you on that. Generally, we are always willing to assess, to review provisions in the administrative code that we enforce, and we've done so multiple times over the past 18 months. I think for that reason, because of the intentional and deliberative process we partook for Introduction 845, it's why the administration continues to support that in hopes that advances through the council.
Absolutely, and I believe we are scheduling, if we haven't already, a hearing on 845, and I completely, you know, agree, obviously, as the sponsor of 845 with its mission. I do believe that this bill 815 needs to be separate because it deals with a completely separate issue, which is agency rulemaking going above and beyond a council legislation and deleteriously impacting the small businesses. So I just want to make clear, I don't agree respectfully that we can roll 815 into 845 because it's like comparing an apple and an orange. Are completely different issues. Yeah,
well, I would say certainly, council member, you know, when legislation goes to the council, I think for us, when it comes to enforcement, clearly we feel that there's a serious issue that's happening there, right? There's a harm that needs to be addressed, and when there's a range, we take it as a discretion to gain knowledge of the industry, understand more about the harm, and understand how we can deter that harm. And I think that ultimately is a question of how we might utilize a range. Notwithstanding, when we issue a penalty schedule, it is public, and we invite public feedback to better understand the issue that's taking place. I think a most recent example that I've had to deal with perhaps is the open captioning law. When we were engaging in that process, that legislative process, I remember Councilmember Rosenthal being very clear that it was important to stop the harm of New Yorkers in our deaf community from not being able to go to a movie theater and enjoy time with their family. And for us, when we looked at the range that was established in the penalty, and when we rulemaked on that range, it was important to have a deterrent effect to ensure that protection was a real protection and that folks in our deaf community would be able to enjoy that protection. So I think ultimately we want to make sure that all our processes, whether that's rulemaking or others, are clear, that they're public, that they're available to businesses so that we can foster and facilitate that culture of compliance.
So can you talk a little bit more about overall, and I know it goes beyond DCWP, but when the administration via agency rulemakings decides to increase the minimum and the maximum fines compared to the local laws? Because I really do believe this has a very negative impact, particularly on immigrant-owned small businesses. So can you just talk about, like, in what criteria, when are agencies deciding to go beyond the city council laws when they're setting these various fines?
I think, I think it really depends on a case-by-case basis, and for that reason, that's why we issue specific penalty schedules for each type of provision of the ad code or where we're enforcing, and why we want to take specific feedback on that particular provision. Again, I think it's important for us to hear from the elected officials, from community boards, from businesses themselves, the regulated communities. I think that is always vital information we could be receiving.
And I just did want to say one other thing. I mean, the other concern that I would have, you know, and I say this as a regulatory lawyer, is like people show up to council hearings, they know about council hearings, so when the council is doing a law, they're going to come and they're going to, you know, come out to testify. In agency rulemaking, you're just not getting the same amount of community feedback. You're not getting hundreds of people who are coming out to testify. So again, that really concerns me that the agencies are kind of going beyond the power of the council in setting some of these fines and going on beyond, quite frankly, the legislative intent.
Well, council member, I can say from DCBP's perspective, we have a robust outreach for our rulemaking. We have thousands of business associations, worker associations, consumer associations within our contact list. We
But
make
how
sure.
many on average come out to, I mean,
I
I
can
know
tell you-
from experience, you know, during my tenure at DCWP, like they're not, hundreds of people are not coming out on average for most agency rulemakings.
Well, perhaps in the most recent years, since we've been able to refine our list and create a much deeper outreach mechanism, you know, I could think of the last two rulemakings that we did, AED, automated employment decision tools, or the minimum pay rate for delivery workers. We had hundreds of people come out for both of those, and I think it's a testament to the work that we do at our agency to make sure that New Yorkers are aware and that they have an opportunity to provide public comment.
And just let me add, let me just add to that briefly, Chair. I mean, as Mr. Ortiz referenced, I mean, a couple of the more recent hearings literally broke our Zoom account temporarily. That's how robust the participation was by different members of the regulated community and from members of the public. But even for rulemaking for our penalty schedules, we do get comments. And we do take those into account.
I would just add, we fixed the Zoom account very quickly.
Yes.
but,
Yes,
but
I'm
we-
sorry, don't mean,
Yeah, but we
I'm
do.
glad to hear you're getting good attendance. I just think, and that might be the exception though, the general rulemaking that the agency does and that most agencies do is not attended by hundreds of, I mean, it just isn't, because a lot of people are just, the majority of small business owners in the city are not aware when an agency is doing rulemaking. So again, we don't need to belabor it. I think it goes to the point and the intent of this piece of legislation, which is to protect small business owners from onerous, burdensome fines. We're not, again, trying to get bad actors off the hook. That is never the intent of what we're trying to do here. So just really want to make sure the agency understands that and works collaboratively with us on this piece of legislation.
Certainly, Councilmember. We're always looking to
Great.
working collaboratively with the council, so I appreciate that.
Okay, and then I just, do you want to ask a question on that? Okay, I'm just going to move to 491, and I'm going to turn it over to my chair and to other council members to ask questions. So on intro 491, a couple questions. We have had some feedback about reducing fees for permits and licenses instead of reducing fines. I don't know if you have any comments to make on that, if the agency is open to that as well.
Yeah, so I can't speak to permits and licenses for small businesses specifically. Sanitation doesn't generally permit or license small businesses. Mostly it's transfer stations and sort of larger
Right.
actors like that. You know, we do fully support regulatory relief for small businesses, particularly in the area of commercial recycling, commercial organics requirements. And you know, we think that's a good direction to go.
Okay, and I know that you've created this food donation portal called Donate NYC. So what is the process of donating through that portal?
Yeah, so the process is pretty straightforward. Let's say you're a food retailer or a food service establishment. You have 3 crates of, and we've actually had this specific example before. You have 3 crates of pasta, and it's a non-perishable good. You go onto the portal. You say, here's my address. I have 3 crates of pasta. You put in any specific requirements of it has to be picked up during this time. I'm available to deliver it, whatever. And then we have a network of nonprofits that are also registered in the portal, and it will show the business the closest nonprofits who are interested in that kind of product. It will also send a notification to those nonprofits saying this product is available in your area. Are you interested in receiving it? And it tries to make that connection between those two.
And how many small businesses right now are using this portal?
So we have, it's not a tremendously large number. It's around 500 businesses registered to donate and around 700 nonprofits registered to receive food.
Okay, so that again, I think goes to the point of why we need this particular bill. We have over 200,000 small businesses in the city. Again, at 500 out of 200,000 is woefully low number, frankly. And so again, I think this is why we need this. I would, by the way, have no issue with trying to roll the legislation into a pre-existing portal. We're not trying to create more administrative work or burdens. That's the last thing, honestly, that we're trying to do. And so I'm very open to conversations about trying to reframe Donate NYC to make it a more robust portal that small businesses are actually utilizing it, and then marrying that with this concept in the legislation of when small businesses are donating the food, then they get relief on some of these fines, so that we're really incentivizing small businesses to donate this excess food so it's not going to waste, and so that we're also dealing with the fact that there are over 1.5 million New Yorkers who are experiencing hunger right now in the city.
Sorry, Councilmember, I don't think I
So
got a question.
it's just, you know, again, you've got this portal, it's not really being used very widely. I think we can all agree on that. And so, again, I'm open in the legislation to trying to seeing if we can parry this Donate NYC into the legislation so that we're not, again, creating a new administrative burden and creating a whole new portal.
Sure, yeah, I think we're certainly open to conversations about how to improve participation in the Donate NYC food donation portal. I do want to say that one, the participation in the food donation portal is in no way representative of the amount of food donation happening in New York City, much of which is happening from businesses to nonprofits, and that's the 29,600 tons number that I mentioned in my testimony. When you also include, sort of neighborhood level relationships between a corner store or a food service establishment and their, church pantry down the street, that number is probably much, much higher. We don't capture all of the donation that's taking place in New York City. So I do think there is a lot of that happening today, and certainly open to conversations about how to capture that as part of this proposal. And then the second piece I do want to raise is, the best thing for businesses is to not have any excess food. So I want to make sure that we're that we're not creating an incentive for businesses to waste food that gets donated. The best thing for a business to do is to buy exactly what it needs to serve its customers, and not throw anything away or donate anything at the end of the day. So just want to make sure we're not creating some kind of perverse incentive there.
Okay, I mean, I don't think any small business would, to just get relief from the violation, end up doing what you're saying that they might do, because that would not be worth it for them. Again, they are in the business to try to sell food to customers, and so I don't share that concern, quite frankly, but appreciate you raising it. I also want to acknowledge we've been joined by Councilmember Mealy, and I'm going to now turn it over to my co-chair, Councilmember Ung, for her questions.
Thank you, Councilmember Menon. I just have a few questions about penalties. How does the agency decide how to set a penalty for a first-time violation in general?
I think generally we are using our experience as an enforcement agency to identify the level that has to be at for a deterrence to be effective. And, for example, let's go back to the example I gave around open captioning, right? The range there was $100 to $500. I think we know through our experience enforcing other provisions that $100 would be too low to deter this activity. So what we do is propose a penalty schedule with the actual number now, which I believe is $325, or yes. So we use that number and a progressive model of building up in the penalty schedule to set a deterrence factor in place. I think it really, sorry.
And it just also, we are also very much listening to the public hearing that happened for the introduction of legislation, where we hear from advocates, where we hear from the members who sponsored the bill and what the harm they believe needs to be remedied and how important they feel it is to set a deterrent.
Yeah, and I think, ultimately, some provisions in the ad code, they could be quite old, decades old. And at times we do, reset our rulemaking for a penalty schedule, adjust for inflation, identify if certain activity hasn't been deterred enough. I think ultimately we want to, that's a testament to ensuring that we're always reassessing penalties, whether that's in rulemaking, whether that's in the ad code, as we have done over the past 18 months, as I mentioned.
Thank you. So the closed caption, the one you just mentioned, is an example of how the first violation is higher than the minimum one that's set by the legislation. Is there any others you could just give some examples to?
Yes, of course. So I mentioned earlier that there are, if you're operating a tobacco retail shop, selling cigarettes unlicensed, That currently is $2,000. That would go down to $250. If you're an immigration service provider and you're deceiving immigrants, currently the first-time violation there is $5,000. That'd be lowered to $500. If you're a debt collector, currently the fine there is $1,000, but that would be lowered to $700. And that's for illegally pursuing a consumer for collecting debt. So this is some of the egregious activity that we've identified preliminarily on this bill. We do know, as my colleagues at DSNY mentioned, there's also parts of their ad code that are implicated. We have been speaking with other agencies. They see that they've been implicated as well. I think for us, it is definitely comforting to know that that is not the intent of the legislation that is before us today. So we're happy to collaborate more on that. But we do want to flag that these particular penalties that we have do cause serious concern if they're lowered.
Okay, and this is one last question of this. How often do you evaluate these penalties?
So, well, with Local Law 80 and with Introduction 845, we did comprehensive reviews of our ad code, and those both happened in the past 18 months.
Excellent, thank you. And then there's two last questions. So how many violations are issued annually by Department of Sanitation?
How many total violations?
Yes.
I don't have that exact number here today, but it's somewhere on the order of 300,000 or 400,000.
Okay.
And many of those violations, Councilmember, are for things like failure to clean your sidewalk, failure to clean 18 inches into the street, important violations that serve to keep our city clean. So that's the vast majority of the violations we issue.
Thank you. And how many violations are issued by DCWP annually?
In 2022, we issued 12,000 summonses.
Okay. Do you have an idea what generally those summonses are, like what Department of Sanitation was saying?
I'd say about, a good portion of them are for unlicensed activity. I think that's principle right there. Yeah. I can say, for example, on the tobacco retail dealer, I know this because we just testified the other week on tobacco retail dealers, but we issued about 2,400 summonses for unlicensed activity for tobacco retail dealers in the past year. So it's certainly a category that is one example of a category we're working actively in there.
Thank you. I'm good with my questions.
Okay, we have a number of colleagues who have questions. Councilmember Brooks Powers.
Thank you, chairs. I just have two really brief questions. Just wanting to understand the other incentives that sanitation and DCWP suggests for small businesses to engage in to donate excess food, but also how could the two agencies facilitate effective coordination between nonprofits and businesses to administer this program?
Sure, thank you for that question, Councilmember. So I think, as I mentioned before, a lot of this donation is already happening. We may not have perfect tracking of who is donating what where, but we don't necessarily want to introduce additional government involvement in a sector that's working really well. There are steps we can take to incentivize additional food donation. I think you're exactly right on that. We think through, for example, our commercial waste zones program, all of the carters that are seeking to participate in that program have to submit zero waste plans. One of the components of that plan is how do you reduce and reuse waste before it becomes waste at the curb. So that's something that we're really looking forward to working with the carters to advance as we implement that program.
But can you talk more about the coordination though between the agencies around this?
Yes, so sanitation is the principal agency working in donation recovery generally. We work very closely with our partners at the Mayor's Office of Food Policy in the food donation space specifically. They have relationships with many of the food pantries, kitchens, and other emergency service providers that are out there. They're also coordinating with Department of Social Services, with HRA, and other agencies that play a critical role in the emergency food space. Not all emergency food is donated food, but all donated food we want to see going to emergency food programs. So there's a lot of coordination happening there. With DCWP specifically, we haven't coordinated previously, but would certainly be open to coordinating with them in the future.
I think certainly in terms of our connections with small businesses and our connections with through our outreach, we're happy to collaborate with DSNY on that and offer whatever assistance we can.
And do you have like a read on through the existing programs that you talk about, where most of the collections are coming from, and then how is it selected in terms of where it then goes?
So it's incredibly varied because the food recovery space is incredibly complex. There are very large organizations like City Harvest and Food Bank for New York City that act primarily as recipients of food. They're also purchasing food on the open market, so they're sort of the intake, and then they distribute that food to a network of hundreds of food pantries and other organizations embedded in communities to actually make sure it's getting to people where they need it and what they need. So it's an incredibly complex network. I can't say specifically that there's one pathway that's the most productive. I think it's important that there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of different approaches that can work here. As I said before, a corner store may have a relationship with the church pantry down the street. That's a great thing. There are other larger businesses like distributors based out of the Hunts Point Food Market, for example, that have direct relationships with City Harvest. And if they have a shipment that doesn't look like it's going to sell, they'll call up City Harvest and say, hey, do you need 3 pallets of broccoli today?
So essentially, you all rely on larger entities like Food Bank and Hunts Point to be this I guess vehicle with the programs that you have established now?
So those relationships are existing. What sanitation has done in our efforts is to convene organizations that are working in this space to share best practices, to talk about what's working, to share their networks with each other. Because in some cases, these nonprofits can be a little territorial, so we try to break down those walls between organizations to make sure that they're all working toward the common good.
Pay like Food Bank or Hunts Point to collect these items at all?
We don't currently, but I know there are substantial emergency food programs operated out of DSS and other agencies that do compensate those organizations.
And so do you have a breakdown in terms of organizations that are MBEs, Minority Business Enterprises?
I don't have that breakdown today, but it's certainly something that we could look into.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairs.
Thank you. And now Councilmember Mealy.
I just have 2 questions. How many summonses do you give to the vendors, the street vendors?
Unfortunately, Councilmember, I don't have that number with me right now. I can say over the course of 2022, we issued 12,000 summonses, but I'm happy to pull that other number for you after this hearing.
Because I would really like...
Overall 12,000, I'm sorry.
Not 12,000 to vendors.
Yeah, overall 12,000 to all businesses.
All
is what I meant to
businesses,
say, yeah.
okay.
Sorry.
Do you have any kind of database on the vets that have vendors' licenses? And could you get me that breakdown on vendors that are vets?
Yes, I'm happy to provide you a breakdown of that, but I don't have that right now with me, I'm sorry.
And I'm just getting kind of concerned, you saying that we're leaving it up to the stores and their businesses to give to nonprofits. So we have no database on who is getting what in each neighborhoods or anything in each district.
So we receive information from our donation and reuse partners about how much material they're taking in. We try not to have our reporting requirements on them be too onerous, because we don't want to create new forms and paperwork that they otherwise wouldn't have, but it's something that we can certainly talk to them about and try to get more information.
I know, but with food insecurities going on right now, I know some food pantries right now that I go and the potatoes are rotten. They didn't give it out, but they let it sit there. And I'm upset because so many people could have utilized those potatoes. So if no one is really knowing how much intake they're getting to distribute it, and who they distributing to, I think we're leaving stuff to fall through the cracks. And I really feel that we should start having a database. Is there any way we can start a database with, let's try one, just all the veterans, since the city is not giving any of our veterans any more licenses, and some of their licenses are being, how can I say, bullied away from them. It's almost like the mob. Is there any way, like City Harvest, we can start tracking that they could give the food that is excess, give it to the vendors of veterans? Could we start a pilot program like that? Is that any way possible?
You know, I think
Think open.
yeah, I think we're certainly open to, and you know, I think would love to have a conversation with you with the Mayor's Office of Food Policy, because they have a
Yes.
tremendous amount of data and information that they track as well. And I know they're looking at things like the EFAP program, which I don't remember what it stands for anymore, but I know that's you know, something that has been tremendously beneficial, especially in the last few years for food pantries. So would love to have a conversation with them as well about how we can both make sure that the food's going to the right places, and the last thing we want to see is those potatoes get wasted, because you know, that's food that could be feeding someone.
Exactly.
And we want to make sure it's going to the right place.
And then in the same process, we could be helping our veterans who I think are being just diminished as vets, getting a part of the big apple pie of having their licenses. It's a shortage right now, and now some people are monopolizing all the licenses. So I really hope I could sit down with Small Business Services real soon to see how we can do that. And I will make sure I follow up with you in regards to that, because everyone is not good actors. They could say they're giving the food. Since we do not have a database of who, what, when, and where, we really don't know. They could be reselling the food. So I have one more question. What recommendations for this legislation would DCWP suggest in order to address potential conflicts?
I'm sorry, Councilmember, did you mean instruction 815 or 491? 815. Oh, thank you. I think from our perspective, it's really a question of what's the question we're trying to answer, so to speak. If it's about making sure that businesses have publicly available information that will disclose to them what their penalties are for a first-time violation, DCWP already does that through our penalty schedules. If it's a question about lowering penalties, I think what we have done over the past 18 months is engage in a robust process to review our administrative code twice to lower those penalties. So I think from our perspective, we have concerns about the manner this legislation approaches the issue of lowering penalties in being so sweeping.
Do you think it's like anytime you got to redo something, do you think it will really get out to the businesses that the violations went down if we pass this legislation?
Well, I can certainly say with respect to Local Law 80, that there was a lot of outreach there that went out to informing businesses across every city agency, I'm sure. If Introduction 845 were to pass too, we would do significant outreach as well to make sure people are aware of those lowered penalties. I think for us, ultimately, from DCWP's perspective, we want to make sure our small businesses are succeeding, so that they're available for our consumers, so that they employ our workers. That is, I think, the ecosystem we envision for New York City.
How would you make sure everyone know? Do you have a budget for that outreach?
Well, we do have dedicated outreach teams. We do collaborate with our sister agencies that might have dedicated outreach teams as well, such as Small Business Services. MOYO, I think it was a good example brought up earlier about immigrant small business owners.
Okay.
I think these are all the tools in that we can leverage for any type of outreach, and it's certainly what we do now.
Thank you.
Sorry, Majority Whip Brooks Powers had a quick follow-up, and then we're going to go to Councilmember Shulman. We've also been joined by Councilmember Krishnan.
Just adding on to Councilmember Mealy, as someone who represents a food insecure community, in the report that she's requesting, going back to my initial inquiry, I would love to see included a breakdown in terms of where the food is collected from, but mostly where it is redistributed, because just from layman perspective, I've observed that there are other communities that have more access to those type of resources that just get overwhelming supplies, to the point that even during the pandemic, I was able in Southeast Queens to get food from these groups because they got so much. But in Southeast Queens and in Rockaway, they weren't getting anything. And I have people in the community through the churches in like Rosedale and all over Southeast Queens that literally go around across the city driving their personal vehicles to find food to bring back to their local pantries. So when you say that Food Bank or Hunts Point or City Harvest, you know, are the ones collecting these items, I think that there's a responsibility to make sure from a city perspective, if you're facilitating this, there should be some onus to make sure they're getting to those food insecure communities. So there needs to be a report on that, but then also beyond the report, a plan of action to make sure that because this could be major in communities that are food insecure. So I just want to thank the chairs for the opportunity again and for these bills to be heard today, because it's really important.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Okay, now we're going to go to Councilmember Schulman, and then followed by Councilmember Caban, who is on Zoom.
Thank you. So one, I want to thank the chairs for this important hearing, and Chairs Ung and Chair Menon. And these are two very important bills. So the question I have is, of all the penalties imposed by Department of Consumer and Worker Protection and the Department of Sanitation, what percentage is actually collected?
Yeah, so for Department of Sanitation, I can't speak to I don't have the number in front of us for total collections, but I know there's a few steps in the process. All of our violations are heard at oath, and then from oath, the actual collection happens at the Department of Finance.
I mean, do you have a sense of, is it 80%, is it 50%, is it 40%?
So of violations that are upheld, I think the collections are on the order of 70 to 80%.
So, and is it the same for Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, or?
Well, Department of Consumer Worker Protection, I can give you the number of fines we've collected, but not as, I don't have the larger delta. It's 14 million in 2022.
Okay,
but I don't have
you don't know the percentage?
No, I'm sorry.
So the reason I'm asking is because, I mean, I would think that the money, the amount of money that you're not collecting, which I think is probably somewhat substantial, wouldn't it be better in terms of Intro 491 for those businesses to be incentivized to give food in lieu of these fines to help with the food insecurity that we have that's a major problem now?
So I think, you know, the types of violations that we're talking about under Intro 491 are a relatively small share of our overall enforcement. As I mentioned before to Chair Ung, our top priority is enforcing things that affect cleanliness and quality of life. That's where we have dedicated the majority of our efforts. That's where Commissioner Tisch has been laser focused since she was appointed last April. You know, I do think that we want to pursue regulatory reform in this space. I think the best way to do that is to reduce first-time penalties, potentially to zero or a very low amount. That's what is called for in Intro 845. That, I think, achieves exactly what we're trying to achieve here, which is for businesses who may not know what the rules are, who may not, you know, have done the right thing the first time, give them an opportunity to learn what the rules are, and then, you know, not have to suffer a burdensome penalty. As far as the specifics of linking regulatory reform to food donation, I just don't know if that's the best way to approach this. We think that regulatory reform and food donation are both important causes that stand on their own, and connecting them, you know, may be unnecessarily onerous.
Well, if you're talking about quality of life, and I understand that, but you still have a percentage of like around 20% from what you're saying that's not collected. So there may be a way to give back on that level, because you're not going to get from them anywhere. If they're not collected, it's going to be really difficult to get it from them. The second question I have, which is for the Department of Consumer Worker Protection, you mentioned about the illegal smoking shops that.
Tobacco retail dealers,
Tobacco,
places
yeah.
that sell tobacco products.
So how much of that is what percentage of that is the illegal weed shops, or is that separate from that?
So, I think the two business categories that we license that are most, that have perhaps overlap with the illegal weed shops are tobacco retail dealers that sell tobacco products, or electronic cigarette retail dealers that sell e-cigarette devices. I think what we have done in the city is utilize city laws such as our licensing requirements to be able to issue penalties to those weed shops that are operating illegally. I know we've also done that supporting the sheriff's task force as well in their particular operations against those illegal weed shops.
Right.
I mean, ultimately, I know the city has had to think very creatively about how to enforce against those particular types of businesses because of the gap in enforcement that has existed at the state level.
So there are fines that are incurred by these illegal businesses, correct? Or
It could be if they're selling if it's a weed shop that's selling a cigarette or cigarettes,
Let's-
we could theoretically go in there and what we do to issue violations.
Let's make it easy. Let's go back to the tobacco, the illegal tobacco licenses. What percentage of that do you actually, so they're fined, correct? When you find that they're not following the law, they get fines?
Yes.
Okay. How much of that is really, have you been able to collect? I just want to finish my.
I had this number the other week. If you don't mind, I'd hope to get it back to you after this hearing. I don't have that number.
Because I would think that if they're operating illegally, it's going to be really difficult to get the fines back from them.
Yeah.
So I just want to state that for the record. But thank you very much, and that's the end of my questioning. Chair, I'm done.
Great, thank you so much. We're now going to go to Councilmember Caban, who's on Zoom.
Starting time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you to Chairs Menon and Ung. I only have one, maybe two questions, because some of my colleagues have already answered some of them, and I know Chair Ung started talking about this a little bit, but how many violations have been issued to food waste generating businesses since DSNY began fully enforcing the mandatory organics recycling rules for the commercial sector last summer? And then also, what's the average amount of these fines? And I apologize for my dog.
Councilmember, could you just repeat that last bit there?
The last part of it was just, what is the average amount of the fines?
Okay, well, I got the first half of the question. So since we resumed commercial organics enforcement last summer, we've issued a total of 727 violations to businesses for either recycling or organics diversion requirements. And that is still a substantial decrease from the issuance levels pre-pandemic. So in 2018, we issued a total of 4,000, just around 4,000. In 2019, almost 3,300 violations for the same types of violations.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure, so I'll repeat that. Calendar year 22, 727. Looking back to before the pandemic, calendar year 2018 was 4,026, calendar year 2019, 3,249.
Okay, thank you. And I want to recognize we've been joined by Council Members Velasquez, Councilmember Ressler, Councilmember Brewer, and I'm now going to turn it over to Councilmember Ressler for a question.
Thank you, Chair Menon and Chair Ung. I was enjoying some seaweed salad. Greg Anderson, it's always a pleasure to see you. How are you?
Always a pleasure as well, Councilmember.
You doing all right?
Excellent.
Great. So I know that you're having a hearing on February 22nd about commercial waste zones, and I'm sorry I was a little late today, but I'm really investing in commercial waste zones. How many years have you been working on commercial waste zones?
I have been working on commercial waste zones since 2015.
2015.
So
what year? 2023?
That's correct.
Oof. So we're closing in on a decade. Is 2023 the year that commercial waste zones are going to be in place in New York City?
You know, I think we do have a hearing coming up in 3 weeks to talk about that, so I want to make sure that we have that conversation in the right context. But I will say we are fully committed to moving ahead with commercial waste zones, and we have our foot on the gas, and we're going to get this done.
Any insight that you can provide on the current timeline for implementation? When will contracts be signed?
Again, hearing coming up in just 3 weeks, so look forward to talking about it there. But what I can say is we are fully committed to moving ahead. We are in the middle of what is a very complicated selection process for these vendors, and we are committed to doing this in a way that is as fair and transparent as possible and does not increase cost for our small businesses. Those are the things that we're focused on, and that's what we're in the middle of the process on right now. We have our foot on the gas, and we look forward to providing the council full update on the 22nd.
I totally appreciate that we're going to get more answers in a few weeks, but 8 years of work to get to this point. There's been an extraordinary amount of research, effort, analysis, and delay. And so my understanding is we've dealt with 3 delays in just closing out of the RFP since Mayor Adams took office. Not COVID-related delays that had held us up for a couple of years before that. So we have you here today, having some additional information. I think that everybody who read the Streets Blog article was deeply concerned about the status of the program. I appreciate you confirming again today that you're committed to its implementation and that you're going to get it over the finish line after 8 hard years of work to get us there, and appreciate your involvement in getting us this far. Can you give us any more information on when contracts will be signed, considering the multiple delays in the RFP?
Look, Councilmember, what I can tell you is one of the most important things that we learned in that process of designing the commercial waste zones program was that we didn't want to repeat the mistakes that Los Angeles had learned. Their program at first was an utter failure. It increased costs for some customers by more than 3 times what they were paying before it was implemented. So what we are focused on is ensuring that we don't repeat those mistakes. We're doing that through the procurement process.
I know,
we will
but
do
Greg,
that
you're
through the
so
outreach
smart
process.
that you've been helping to ensure that we're avoiding those mistakes over the 8 years that you've been working on this. If anyone is smart enough to figure out how to do this, it's you and some of your colleagues at Disney. You know how much respect and appreciation I have for the work that you do. We really need to see timelines for when this is getting implemented. The ongoing delays are unacceptable. You know as well as I do that people are dying in the commercial carting industry. It is awful for our environment. It leads to many times over more trucks miles in New York City every year that are totally avoidable. This is a critical environmental justice, worker justice initiative, and we need to get it done. So I'm a little frustrated that you're not giving us anything other than we're committed to it happening. I appreciate your commitment. I just want to ask, because it's an area of such concern of mine across every agency in the city of New York, how many people are working full-time on this initiative right now?
I think the number right now is around 26.
26 lines that are fully staffed?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers in front of me. Again, not prepared to discuss this topic here today. We're here to talk about small business regulatory reform.
I know.
But it's around that number.
All right. My understanding from the reporting is that a minority of the positions are actually filled, and that across the board in this administration, we have high concentrations of vacancies because lines are not being approved, PARs are not being approved, and it is delaying essential work. And so I am deeply concerned about every agency's ability to hire and hire swiftly, and that it's undermining our achievement of critical initiatives such as this one. I would imagine if this office was fully staffed up and functional, we would have made a lot more progress on implementation on commercial waste zones today than we've made, and that is deeply disappointing. So I would appreciate it if it's possible to get this information in advance of the hearing in a few weeks of how many people are working on this full time and how many positions are vacant.
Sure, we'll be happy to reach out to your office about that.
Thank you very much. It's always good to see you, Greg.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to turn it to Councilmember Brewer for questions.
Thank you. Relevant to today's hearing. The issue of 491, and I understand the concern you have, but I certainly understand the need to support people getting fed. But I have a friend named Anna Sachs, whom I think sanitation knows. She goes into the drugstores, food establishments, public schools, and the list goes on every night, and finds what's in their refuse bags. And it's a combination of everything. So I guess I'd like to know, just generally, because the waste is mind-blowing, you know, from diapers to every drugstore product you can think of to the food. And so I was just, there are two concerns, I guess. One is it's going to add to the landfill because it's not necessarily going in the right refuse pile. And then secondly, it's wasted. So I was just wondering if there's, beyond the food, is there any discussion about what you think should happen? It's not an easy issue to deal with, I'm aware of it. But my goodness, what is in those bags? And so I'm just wondering if there's any overall thought about how we can handle this beyond the food.
Yeah, so I think, and thank you, Councilmember, for your on-topic question there.
Your commissioner met her. I made them meet each other. It was quite an interesting meeting at 10 o'clock at night. So just so you know.
I have heard stories of that meeting,
Yes.
so I understand that it was interesting.
Yes.
You know, I fully agree with you, Councilmember, that it's absolutely atrocious when people waste things that are perfectly good. And one of the things that sanitation has been focused on for many, many years, going back to Local Law 19 of 1989 and even before that, is trying to make sure that the things that we're collecting in the trash are not things that could be used, you know, used as perfectly good products, recycled into other products, what have you, composted into renewable energy or beneficial soil additive. And so, you know, we are always trying to think about how we can put incentives in place, take the right kind of enforcement action to reduce the amount of waste that is happening, especially in New York City businesses. You know, as I think Councilmember Ressler would agree, we think that commercial waste zones is an important step to improving recycling, improving composting, improving a number of different things in the commercial sector. We are moving full steam ahead on that program and hope to make you know, really good progress in the coming months. That's, I think, the best thing that we can do. You know, I think one of the directions that other municipalities, other states have gone in is mandating food donation. So not just mandating composting of food waste, but also mandating the donation of food that is edible or usable. You know, I think we have to be wary of taking that step because it could increase the burden on our small businesses, but it's also a step that has been taken in other places, and I think we should have a real conversation about.
Okay, so commercial could perhaps deal with the diapers from CVS, whatever, because they do get thrown out in perfect shape. Maybe that's what you're saying, but you also, I want to just let you know, the public schools are equally guilty, and they are a residential pickup, not a commercial pickup. So I just think in general, and there may be other residential pickups that I'm not aware of that have similarly, even though it sounds residential, it might be might not be a commercial pickup, et cetera. You know, sometimes there's a gray line there. A lot of the nonprofits pick up residential. I don't know what they throw out. So I just think in general, it would be interesting for me to see that the commercial waste plan will in fact deal with what you're saying, because I thought it would be the same, different schedule, less trucks, but the same pickup stuff. So maybe I'm misunderstanding. I will, unlike my colleague, wait until the hearing to discover that. Thank you.
And Councilmember, I will just add on the schools, that's something that we're very focused on. You know, schools are in every single community. Not only, you know, do some of them throw out stuff that could be used, but they're not always the best in terms of putting things out at the right time in a neat, orderly manner. So that's something that we're laser focused on. We're in conversations with DOE about how to fix that problem. We're also working with DOE over the course of this school year and next to have composting at every single school citywide for the first time ever.
Right.
So this year,
It's not the first time ever. It was done before and then stopped.
It was never done citywide before, Councilmember.
It was tried.
This is the first time ever that we're going to have the entire borough of the Bronx have school composting by the end of this school year, and by the end of next school year, it'll be in every single public school in New York City.
We can debate that. It was tried before and then stopped, because I was there in the room, just FYI. But I think it's all needs a lot of assistance, but thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And now I'm going to turn it to Councilmember Mealy for a follow-up question.
I just have two questions. Do you have any data on the community gardens with their compost? Because some of the gardens, sometime they harvest and sometime they don't. But then if no one does it, where do that food that is grown go? Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, so I don't have data with me today on that topic, but it's something that, you know, we support a network of hundreds of various community gardens, community composting organizations through our New York City Compost Project. It's something that we've been longtime supporters of, so we not only teach them how to do the right things, we also you know, give them tools to become assets for the community so that people can drop off their food scraps, you know, from their kitchen at their local garden. So it's
But
something
if
that
no one is in the garden, because sometime they open, sometime they're not, is sanitation, when they just harvest and people do drop off their scraps and no one is there, sanitation come and just discard it?
That's obviously never the goal. So we want to try to give people as much information as possible about where and when to drop off their food scraps. You know, you may have seen in the news we have these new orange bins that are open 24/7. They're great. We want to keep expanding that program. So it's certainly something that I think we're on the same page about the intent there, and happy to have further discussions about how to improve the operation of those sites so that you know, that it's working for everyone.
I hope, can I indulge one more?
Of course.
Chairs? Is there any, since we're trying to make sure that food insecurity, if an organization or a senior center do not have food, do you know of any organization would be willing to feed a senior center? At least we would know for sure if they given the food.
Yeah, I know there are dozens, maybe hundreds of organizations across New York City who are.
These are senior centers, government.
Yep.
That is not getting fed. So I really asking if you have organizations that we can make sure people are getting fed in these senior centers.
Yep,
that do not have a city food program. That's easy.
I hear you loud and clear, Councilmember. You know, at sanitation, our focus is on diverting things from the waste to the extent we can. But I know our partners at the Mayor's Office of Food Policy, and just a quick aside here, you know, when COVID happened, you know, my former boss and commissioner was appointed food czar for New York City, so I do happen to know a little bit more about this than the average sanitation employee. But I know that the Mayor's Office of Food Policy works very closely with New York City Aging, with other social services agencies, to ensure that where there are gaps, that those gaps are being filled. And Councilmember, I hear you loud and clear. Happy to have that conversation with those agencies and send the message to them.
Please, I don't want to put anyone on the spot right now, but you say, but people doing it is a whole different. So thank you. I look forward. Thank you, chairs.
Thank you so much. Okay, we are now, I'm going to turn it back over to CJ to hear from members of the public. So thank you to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, chairs. Our first panel will be Andrew Ridgey and Robert Bookman.
Yeah, please
Good
begin.
afternoon. My name is Andrew Ridgey. I am the Executive Director of the New York City Hospitality Alliance, and I'm joined by our counsel, Robert Bookman. Thank you to the chairs and council members. Wow, that was a bit disheartening. There's been so much talk in the city about reducing fines on small businesses, and I know that this council and this administration has been trying to do a lot, but I've been in the industry my whole life and advocating on behalf of the hospitality industry for almost 20 years. Rob Bookman even longer, and I don't really recall a time that agencies ever voluntarily decided to reduce fines, with maybe an exception under Commissioner Menon, or former Commissioner Menon. You know, what this bill does right here, 815, essentially just says reduce the fines to what the intent of the city council, the legislative body that created these violations, set the minimum at. And I do not think anyone, at least we are not, advocating to reduce egregious fines for egregious penalties when it comes to, you know, underage smoking and violating the rights of immigrants. You could simply exempt those in the legislation, or you could go back and you could amend the actual law and increase the violation to something that you would feel is more appropriate. But this bill simply helps reform the regulatory structure that's in place that has made the city so difficult on small businesses over multiple administrations. And with this administration and this council, we know you all care, and we know you're all talking about reducing fines. And you can do that by certain amendments here and there, making sure when you pass a new law that establishes a violation, that it reduces or provides a cure period or a warning for a first-time violation. But in addition to that, you need to change the regulatory structure that allows fines to be too high. We just saw this recently over the past year, where DCWP had to do rulemaking for a new violation established by the council. They had a range of what I believe was $500 for a minimum penalty, and they came back and they scheduled the first violation in their proposed rules at $1,500. So $1,000 more than was proposed, or that was the minimum in the city council's legislation and your intent. Thankfully, when we brought it up to them, they did reduce it down to the minimum, but it shouldn't be incumbent on us to have to identify that every single time there's rulemaking, and it shouldn't be up to the council to have to review to make sure that the agencies are following your legislative intent. So we really think that this bill, if there needs to be tweaks here or there that Rob can speak about and we can all discuss, we're welcome to those conversations. But the intent of this bill, as you said earlier, is to change the regulatory structure, help reduce fines on small businesses. And then finally, Chair, you had mentioned in the second bill, 491, instead of trying to encourage additional food donations, which we should absolutely be doing by reducing fines, we should just focus on reducing fines because they're too high and it's the right thing to do. And instead, let's start just reducing the fees for licenses and permits if you donate food, because that'll also have more widespread application, because not every single business may be issued fines and then they're not incentivized. So they all have to get licenses and fee and permits, reduce that. And I'll close it off with that and turn it over to my colleague Rob Bookman, and I'm sure we're happy to answer questions.
Thanks, buddy. Hi, my name is Rob Bookman. I've been deeply involved in New York City administrative law now for decades, from my early days at the Department of Consumer Affairs, where I was counsel, where I had the adjudication division, which was the administrative law division that heard these hearings, to decades of private practice. I've represented thousands of businesses over the years before numerous adjudicatory agencies, doing all different types of violations. And I can tell you that it is extremely difficult to get a sense and an understanding of the fine structures in New York City. They're all over the place. You know, and it's part the council's fault and it's part the administrative agency's fault. Over the decades, you pass a law, a new licensing law, a new requirement, and you put fines in there. Sometimes, and I've handed up in my packet, if you have it, different examples, which if you'll give me a couple of extra minutes afterwards, I'll give you why I gave you these examples. Sometimes the council is very clear, and it says a fine shall be no less than, let's say, $200 on a first violation and no more than $500. In those situations, there shouldn't be any confusion, and I don't believe the administrative agencies have any right, under any rulemaking, to change that structure. Yet they do. And I've had this conversation with speakers going back to Gifford Miller. The question is, who is in charge of the law, the council or the administrative agencies? You give them rulemaking authority, but they can't change the law. And when you give a range of fines and they change that range, they change that minimum, they are changing the law. And it's time that that stopped. That's an easy example. More complicated, however, and they were trying to give you a couple of bad actor examples to try to, blow a lot of smoke at you on this. More common is where council has passed laws over the decades where it doesn't say what the minimum is, but it gives either a maximum or it has language like not more than. Parking garages, secondhand dealers. I'm using examples from our joint consumer affairs history together. Pedicabs, however, a more recent one, the council said not less than 200 or more than 500. Those are the easy ones. The general consumer affairs says shall not exceed $500. In my opinion, as a lawyer who, I don't claim to be Clarence Darrow, but when it comes to administrative law, it's my thing. What the council is saying when it says not more than or not to exceed is that the full range of penalties from $0 or $1 to that maximum should be available if you choose to go to an administrative hearing and either challenge that violation or, more often than not, say, yeah, I did it, but here's my mitigation, and here's the reasons why I don't think I should get the highest penalty. And that they are taking away over and over again from the administrative law judges and from you by creating a minimum that does not allow for up to or no more than. They're creating a statutory minimum which you never created. You know how to do it. You did it with pedicabs. You did it with one of the examples in my packet that I gave you, where I think it's the, give me a second, it's the air code. Where the council's, the first packet, where the council specifically says what the maximum and the minimum is for every violation, and DEP comports with that for the most part from, in my limited experience. So you know how to do that when you want to do it. The clear legislative interpretation of when you say no more than is that you are providing a full range of penalties. And what this legislation needs to do, and it could be tweaked, I'm not saying it's perfect, is always make that full range available to the administrative law judge. Even in that first violation, bad actor example that they gave, sale of tobacco to a minor. Nobody wants tobacco to be sold to a minor. Let's start off with that. It's a bad violation. But I have represented immigrant business owners, Indian, Pakistani, it's their first business. It's the first time they got a violation. They're outraged by it. It was an employee who did it. They fired the employee who did it. They go to a hearing, and Consumer Affairs has instructed oath that the maximum set by law, $1,000, is the only penalty available.
Okay. Thank
That's
you.
wrong, and that's what we have to address. We have to allow that full range of penalties that you've set by law to be in practice.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, both of you, for your testimony. I do have a couple questions. So on the bad actor issue, it seems to me that the easiest way to address that in the legislation is to make a tweak to the legislation to clearly say when there is no consumer harm. Because that is what we did at Consumer Affairs. In my tenure with the Small Business Relief Package, it was to go after the picayune violations. It was not to go after safety violations where there's like real consumer harm. So it seems that there's a very easy fix to that.
You certainly could go that way, and it would be easier for them to give you a list. And it's multiple agencies. It's sanitation, it's DEP, it's buildings department, it's consumer affairs, it's health department. Easier for them to give you a list of which ones they would want excluded from the legislation than for you to figure it out. One of the ones I just gave you is the air code penalty, and I didn't even give you all the pages of it. I gave you the first 3 pages of the various, penalties just in that one code, under DEP. So, yes, but I would argue from a due process purist that even that bad sale to minor, even when there's consumer harm, the range of penalties for mitigation should still be available to that business owners when they go to the hearing. Otherwise, why bother going to the hearing?
Right. Okay. Well, I really want to thank, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to see if they have questions. I really want to thank both of you for your incredibly thoughtful testimony. This is an important issue. You all have been on the forefront of trying to advocate for small businesses and reducing fines. And I also was very surprised at the testimony today because, you know, we're trying to help these small businesses who are being socked with thousands of dollars of fines. These two bills are two straightforward ways to do it and to accomplish other policy issues, to deal with issues around hunger, food waste. So they're very straightforward. So it was surprising. I'm not going to lie. The testimony today, it was disheartening. I think is a perfect word to describe it. But I want to thank you both for your testimony.
And we want to thank you for actually putting this idea, which has, again, been discussed for decades, to pen to paper. Yeah, we could work on the language a little bit. You know, we always can. We're always willing to compromise. That's not a concern. One of the, to give you an example, one quick conclusion. One of the submissions I gave you, it shows that the default penalty is double or triple than if you go to the hearing, which makes no sense for anybody. You know, if you feel that you're guilty and you don't want to spend a half a day to go to the hearing, default penalty should be the minimum, not 3 times the minimum. So they're actually encouraging people who are guilty in that particular example to go down there because that's the only way to get the minimum fine that you set by statute. Makes no sense.
Chair, do you, okay. Any other council members have questions? Okay, great. Thank you both so much.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
We'll now be turning to Zoom panelists. Our first panelist will be Anna Sachs. After that, we'll be hearing from Justin Wood. Anna Sachs, you may begin upon the sergeant's announcement.
Starting time.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this hearing. Thank you, Councilmember Brewer, for the shout out. My name is Anna Sachs. I am a waste expert in New York City. I wanted to say that I think this bill specifically linking food donation to recycling and composting is well-intentioned but misguided. I don't believe these issues should be paired. I think, you know,
Anna,
collecting cardboard.
Talk more slowly because you're talking too fast.
Okay, sorry, I want to get allotted. But I think that bundling together cardboard and baling it, then selling it on the secondary market is a different issue than taking excess edible food and giving it to people who are hungry. So I think that we shouldn't be pairing these two issues. We should be looking at them separately. Very few of the businesses that I look at, I go through their waste, actually recycle or compost. I want to call out Fairway, Citarella, Gristedes, and D'Agostino. None of them are composting, despite the fact that for 5 years now, they've been required to. So either the issue is that the fines are too insufficient or not sufficiently applied. And I mean, I think that's the issue, right? That they actually don't care or they're not receiving the fines. So they should be following the law. And very few of them actually recycle other than cardboard. If we want to actually have more food donations, I think there are other things that we can be doing. One is we could be requiring that places like CVS and Duane Reade, Walgreens, those sort of places actually donate their excess food. They oftentimes don't have those food donation relationships set up. Another is we could do waste audits of the grocery stores and determine what are they throwing out and finding different sources where they can distribute the food. Another is just addressing the wasted food at the food banks. We have the assumption that once the food ends up in the food bank, it's actually used, and that's not necessarily the case. We could also be doing waste audits of food banks. So that could be a very straightforward preliminary way to determine where the food is not being donated, where it could be donated. I think that we need to have businesses follow the law. They need to be recycling. They need to be composting, just like everyone else, you know, in New York City needs to be recycling and hopefully composting. And that ideally they would be donating also their food. And I think that we could do things to strengthen that. But I disagree with pairing those two issues. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next panelist will be Justin Wood. And at this time, if there's anyone on the Zoom whose name hasn't been called and is waiting to testify, please use the Zoom raise hand function. Justin Wood, you may begin upon the sergeant's announcement.
Starting time.
Hello, thank you everyone. Thank you to Chairs Ung and Menon for holding this hearing. My name is Justin Wood. I'm the Director of Policy at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I want to echo the concerns of my friend Anna Sachs and others that while we fully support the intention of Intro 491 to boost food donations in this city, and we really appreciate the council's focus on the related issues of the climate impacts of food waste, disposing food waste in landfills and incinerators, where the vast majority of it is going, overproduction of food in our city, and then, of course, the vast food insecurity and hunger that so many New Yorkers are experiencing. We really appreciate the intent of this bill to start to address that. We've gone out on, like just last summer, the same week that DSNY was scheduled to begin enforcement of the commercial organics and recycling laws. We were lucky enough to join Anna and others on a zero waste tour in Manhattan. We went out in the evening when businesses were closing. And frankly, usually I don't testify with anecdotes, but it was shocking what we saw. It was huge, and Councilmember Brewer talked about this too. Huge black garbage bags, and these are not small businesses that were violating organics and recycling laws. These were big businesses, including some of the ones Anna mentioned. Huge garbage bags full of fresh edible bread, vegetables, just expired dairy products. It was expected, but frankly shocking to see the level of food waste coming not just from small businesses, but from big, we know to be profitable grocery chains and restaurant chains in our city, while New Yorkers across the city are also going hungry, and we're all too aware of the climate crisis and the impact that waste has on that. So we do agree that action is necessary. We disagree with this approach for some of the reasons that came out in the hearing today. DSNY's enforcement of the current organics law is minimal, as we heard from DSNY. We've also gone through the open data. There's just very few of these fines being issued, and it's not clear that forgiving violators would be a sufficient motivation for the bigger businesses, especially that are producing so much food waste, to start participating in food donation. So a couple of approaches we'd be really happy to work with the council on. One, I think mandating food donation, as Deputy Commissioner Anderson mentioned, we would support that, especially again for the larger businesses that are highly profitable, could easily work this into their operations. There's no reason we shouldn't mandate it. There is a mandate at the state level, but it doesn't apply to New York City, which is concerning. And then secondly, as we heard a lot of testimony about, we've been pushing for years for the implementation of the commercial waste zones program. And that is an opportunity to ensure that businesses' incentives and the waste haulers' incentives are for the first time aligned, and there's consistent, clear, in multiple languages, customer education on how to donate food, on how to reduce food waste, and how to properly source, separate, and ensure that the remaining scraps are composted or anaerobically digested alongside of other recyclables. I know I'm over time. I'll just wrap up by saying we also, New York Lawyers also has concerns about Local 815 in some of the specific impacts that reducing some of the violations where there is a range might have on polluters and the most problematic bad actors that also take advantage of consumers. Two instances we see representing our clients are the violations on transfer stations, waste transfer stations, and then on violators of the immigration services providers in the consumer protection laws. So we would really want to see a full schedule, and have the public see across every agency what the impacts of implementing this bill would be, and we would urge a more narrow, tailored approach than this sort of broad approach to changing the fines where there may be unintended consequences on bad actors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And again, to clarify, as I said at the outset, the bill is in no way intended to apply to waste transfer stations. It's not intended to apply to bad actors. That's the last thing it's intended to apply. It's supposed to be, again, for first-time violators where there isn't a safety harm, consumer harm. So just to clarify that. But I really appreciate your testimony. Thank you very much.
Just to make sure we haven't missed anyone, do we have Alex Stein or Irvinia Moody? If you're on the Zoom, please raise the Zoom raise hand function. And seeing no hands raised, Chair, I'll turn it over to you to close this out.
Anything else? Okay. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you all very much. I first of all want to once again thank my co-chair, Sandra Ung, for this hearing. Is there anything you want to say? Okay, great. Then we're going to close the hearing. Thank you very much.